She thought he was just a driver until the Mafia boss kissed her hand. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The lie was a small, fragile thing, born of shame and the biting chill of a late autumn rain. It formed on Lucinda Vance's lips the moment the long, dark sedan slid to a silent stop beside her on the curb. She had been running, the thin silk of her gala dress clinging unpleasantly to her skin, the echoes of Julian's cruel laughter chasing her from the museum's marble steps. Each clicking heel on the wet pavement was a frantic heartbeat, a desperate flight from the utter ruin he had made of her life. One moment she was an archivist with a promising future, the next she was a pariah, fired and publicly accused of a crime he had committed. The gala had been her last stand, a final, foolish attempt to network her way back into a world that had slammed its doors in her face, and Julian had been there waiting to twist the knife one last time. The rear window of the car whispered down, revealing a man's silhouette in the dim interior. He did not speak, merely inclined his head, an invitation into the warmth and stillness of the vehicle. Desperation was a powerful motivator, overriding the caution that had been drilled into her since childhood. She was soaked, shivering, and utterly defeated. Getting into a stranger's car seemed a lesser danger than remaining on this street, a public spectacle of misery. She slid onto the plush leather seat, the door closing with a heavy, satisfying thud that sealed off the sound of the storm in the city. She thought he was a driver, a chauffeur for some wealthy patron she had not noticed, taking pity on a woman in distress. The car smelled of rich leather and something else, a clean, masculine scent that was both subtle and commanding. "Where to?" His voice was low and unexpectedly smooth, a deep baritone that seemed to hum through the seat beneath her. It held no judgment, only a calm expectation of an answer. The lie came easily. She gave him the address of a grand old apartment building on the Upper East Side, a place she had once catalogued architectural prints of, a building whose name was synonymous with old money and impenetrable security. To admit she lived in a fifth-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a landlord who was 2 weeks from evicting her felt like a final, unbearable surrender. She needed just for this ride to pretend she was someone else, someone who belonged in a car like this, someone who was not utterly and completely broken. They drove in silence for several long minutes, the city lights blurring into long streaks of color through the rain-slicked windows. The quiet was not awkward, it was deep and contemplative, a shared space that felt safer than any she had known in months. She found herself watching his reflection in the rearview mirror, a strong jaw, dark hair cut impeccably short, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He handled the powerful car with an effortless grace, his hands steady on the wheel. "A difficult evening?" he asked, his gaze meeting hers briefly in the mirror. The simple question pierced through her carefully constructed composure. A sob caught in her throat, thick and painful. "You could say that," she managed, her voice trembling. She did not know why, but in the anonymous dark with this silent stranger the truth felt possible. "I lost my job, my reputation. I was accused of something I didn't do by someone I once trusted completely." The words spilled out, a torrent of grief and injustice she had held inside for weeks. She told him everything, not in a frantic rush, but in a slow, tired recounting of the betrayal, the framing, the professional death sentence. He listened without interruption, his steady presence a strange anchor in her storm. He did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply listened, and in his silence she felt heard in a way she had not felt in years. By the time they pulled up in front of the ornate, canopied entrance of the building she had named, her confession had run its course, leaving her feeling hollowed out but strangely lighter. "We're here," he said softly. "Thank you," she whispered, fumbling for the door handle, ready to slip out and disappear into the night to walk the 20 blocks back to her real life. But the door was open for her from the outside. He had gotten out and circled the car in the driving rain, his expensive suit surely getting ruined. He stood there, holding an umbrella over the open door, waiting. He was taller than she had realized, broad-shouldered and imposing, yet his movements were fluid and precise. As she stepped onto the pavement, she reached into her small clutch for the last of her cash, a crumpled $20 bill. "For your trouble," she said, her cheeks burning with humiliation. He ignored the money, his dark eyes fixed on her face. Then he did something that shattered her perception of the entire encounter. He took her hand, the one not holding the foolish offering of cash, and lifted it. His grip was firm, his skin warm against her chilled fingers. He bent his head, his focus entirely on her, and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, just above the knuckles. It was not a fleeting, polite gesture. It was a kiss of possession, of deliberate intent, a brand of warmth against her cold skin that sent a jolt straight through her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the rain, the city, the lie she had told, it all receded, leaving only the startling intimacy of his touch. He straightened, his eyes still holding hers. "My name is Edmund Emerson," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her very bones, and in that moment Lucinda knew he was not a driver. He was something else entirely, something far more dangerous and powerful than she could possibly have imagined. The small, fragile lie she had built had just crumbled, and she had a terrifying feeling that her entire world had crumbled with it. The illusion of her fabricated life lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, a sleek black motorcycle courier, clad in leather that bore a discreet silver E emblem, delivered a thick vellum envelope to her actual apartment. The address was correct down to the scuffed apartment number, a detail that sent a cold dread coiling in her stomach. He had found her. Of course he had found her. A man like Edmund Emerson, a name that resonated with the kind of power that shaped skylines and whispered through the city's financial corridors, would not be deterred by a simple lie. Inside the envelope was not a threat or a bill for his time, but a formal letter on heavy cream-colored stationery. It was a job offer, a position that seemed tailored for her with unnerving precision: chief archivist for the Emerson Group's private historical collection. The salary listed was a staggering figure, enough to erase her debts, secure her future, and silence the gnawing panic that had become her constant companion. It was a lifeline, but she had the distinct feeling it was attached to a hook. Summoning the last dregs of her pride, she went to the Emerson Tower, a monument of black glass and steel that pierced the sky. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalist wealth, silent and intimidating. Her name, however, was expected. She was ushered into a private elevator that ascended with dizzying, silent speed to the penthouse floor. His office was less a room and more a kingdom, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city she had felt so lost in just the night before. And there he was, standing not in a driver's suit, but in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that spoke of bespoke craftsmanship and immense expense. He was not just a man in a room, he was the master of it, the gravitational center around which everything, including the light and air, seemed to bend. He turned from the window as she entered, his eyes the same intense, observant black she remembered. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice as smooth and commanding as it had been in the car, "I'm glad you came." "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be. "And this job offer, it's absurd, you don't even know me." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "I know that you are Lucinda Vance, formerly the most promising junior archivist at the Metropolitan Museum. I know that you were framed for the theft of 18th-century cartographical prints by your former lover, Julian Croft, a man of mediocre talent and questionable ethics. And I know that you are in desperate need of a position worthy of your skills." He gestured to a leather chair opposite his massive desk. "As for finding you, my security team is exceptionally competent. There are very few people in this city who can hide from me if I wish to find them." The statement was delivered as a simple fact, devoid of arrogance but filled with an unnerving certainty that chilled her to the bone. This was his power, asserted quietly but absolutely. She remained standing, wrapping her arms around herself. "And what about Julian?" she asked, the name tasting like ash. "What does this have to do with him?" "Mr. Croft is no longer your concern," Edmund stated, his gaze unwavering. "His recent professional indiscretions have come to the attention of several influential boards and collectors. His academic credentials are under review for plagiarism. I believe he will find his career prospects have been permanently curtailed." He had not raised his voice, had not made a single overt threat, yet the message was brutally clear. He had destroyed Julian overnight, quietly and efficiently, like swatting a fly. The act was terrifying in its scope and terrifyingly seductive in its result. A part of her, the part that had wept with impotent rage, felt a savage surge of satisfaction. It was a dark, ugly feeling, and it frightened her. She finally sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak. He was offering her not just a job, but retribution. He was offering her safety. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all of this for a stranger you gave a ride to in the rain?" He moved from behind his desk and perched on its edge, closer to her now, his presence filling the space between them. "Because I do not believe in coincidence," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "And because when I saw you on that street, I recognized something, a strength you believe you've lost. I am a collector of rare and valuable things, Miss Vance, and I find I have a desire to add you to my collection." The words should have been insulting, objectifying. But the way he said them, with a raw, possessive heat in his eyes, sent a shiver of something else entirely through her. It was not ownership he was speaking of, but a value of being seen and claimed. He was tempting her with a world of wealth and power, a world where men like Julian could not touch her. All she had to do was step inside. Left with no other viable path, she accepted. The next day, her meager belongings were moved into a stunning, fully furnished apartment in a high-security building near the river, a building he owned. The job was real, the archives vast and fascinating, but she was acutely aware that her life was no longer her own. Edmund's presence was a constant, unspoken force. A car was always waiting for her. Her security was assured. He would appear in the archives, his silent observation a heavy weight in the quiet rooms, his questions about her work a pretense for something deeper. and one evening he came to her apartment with an invitation, or rather a command. "You will have dinner with my family tonight." It was at that dinner, in a sprawling mansion filled with watchful, powerful people who all bore his name, that she understood the true nature of her new reality. He sat her at his right hand, a place of honor, and while the conversation swirled around them, his hand rested on the small of her back, a silent, unequivocal declaration to his entire world: "This one is mine." Life within the golden cage Edmund Emerson had constructed for her was a study in paradoxes. Lucinda had never felt safer, and she had never been more aware of the invisible bars. The Emerson Group archives were a scholar's dream, a trove of historical documents and artifacts that he had allowed her to curate with complete autonomy. The work was a balm to her wounded professional pride, a space where her skills were not just valued but revered. Her apartment was a sanctuary of quiet luxury, a place so far removed from her previous life of constant anxiety that it felt like it belonged to another person. Yet beneath the surface of this new, protected existence, a current of unease constantly flowed. Edmund's protection was absolute, but it was also suffocating. He was a shadow at the edge of her life, his influence felt in every convenience, every closed door, every person who treated her with a deference that bordered on fear. He was temptation embodied, his quiet intensity, his sharp intelligence, and the startling moments of consideration he showed her were a constant pull against the independence she desperately wanted to reclaim. The past, however, was not as easily erased as Edmund had led her to believe. Julian Croft, stripped of his career and his reputation, was a man with nothing left to lose, and such men are uniquely dangerous. The harassment began subtly, a series of blocked calls and anonymous, venomous emails that slipped through the formidable firewalls of the Emerson network. Then he appeared. She saw him across the street from her apartment building one evening, a gaunt figure in the twilight, his face a mask of bitter resentment. The sight of him sent a spear of ice through her veins. She retreated from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, the sense of security he had built around her shattering like glass. She did not tell Edmund. It was a foolish act of defiance, a desperate attempt to handle one part of her life on her own, to prove that she was not entirely his creature. Her silence was a mistake. Julian grew bolder. One afternoon he managed to bypass the lobby security, confronting her in the elevator as she returned from work. He was gaunt and smelled of stale liquor, his eyes wild with a desperate fury. "You think he can protect you forever?" he hissed, blocking her exit. "You think you're better than me. I know what you are, Lucy. I know what we did." He was referring to the dark mark on her own history, a secret she guarded with fierce shame. Years ago, when they were both struggling postgraduates, Julian had persuaded her to use her skills to authenticate a minor painting he knew to be a clever forgery. It was a single, desperate act to pay off a mountain of student debt, a transgression she had regretted every day since. It was the leverage he had always held over her, the secret that kept her tethered to him long after her love had curdled into fear. Before she could respond, the elevator doors slid open on her floor, revealing two of Edmund's security men. They were always there, discreet but omnipresent. They did not speak. They simply stepped forward, their large frames boxing Julian in. One of them looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Vance, Mr. Emerson is waiting for you in your apartment." They escorted Julian away, and Lucinda knew with a sinking finality that she had lost her futile bid for independence. Edmund was waiting for her, standing by the window, his back to her. The tension in the room was a palpable thing. "You should have told me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned, and there was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold, hard anger. "I wanted to handle it myself," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is handled now," Edmund stated flatly. The finality in his tone left no room for doubt. Julian Croft would never bother her again. The knowledge was both a relief and a source of profound horror. "But he told my head of security something interesting. He said you have a talent for authenticating forgeries." The accusation hung in the air between them. This was the moment of judgment. The shame she had carried for years rose up, choking her. She sank onto the sofa, the fight draining out of her. "It was once," she confessed, her eyes on the floor. "Years ago, I was desperate. I needed the money. It was a mistake, and I have lived with it ever since." She finally looked up, meeting his hard gaze, ready for the condemnation, for the disgust, for him to cast her out. Instead, he crossed the room and sat beside her, his expression softening into something she could not decipher. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his immaculate white shirt and rolled up his sleeves, then began to unbutton the shirt itself. She watched, confused and silent, as he pulled the fabric aside, revealing the taut, scarred skin of his torso. A long, jagged scar ran from his collarbone down his side, a pale, puckered line against his olive skin. It was an old wound, but a vicious one. "I was 22 when I got this," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It was a gift from my uncle, my father's most trusted advisor. He betrayed my father to a rival family. I watched them kill him. My uncle left me for dead." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, ancient pain that mirrored the shame in her own heart. "My empire is built on the foundation of that betrayal. I learned that day that the only currency that has any real value in this world is loyalty." Your mistake was born of desperation, his was born of greed, they are not the same. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. Your past does not matter to me, Lucinda, your honesty right now is all that matters. In that moment, the last of her resistance crumbled. He had seen the ugliest part of her and he had not flinched. He had answered her vulnerability with his own, showing her the wound that had forged the ruthless man he was today. The bars of her cage seemed to melt away, replaced by the threads of a bond that was deeper and more powerful than anything she had ever known. The confession became a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of fear and resistance that stood between them. In its place, a fierce and consuming intimacy bloomed. Their relationship, which had been a slow dance of pursuit and retreat, ignited into a passionate fire. Edmund's possessiveness, once a source of her apprehension, now felt like a shield. He was a man of profound control in every aspect of his life, yet with her in the privacy of their shared nights he showed a raw tenderness that was utterly disarming. He learned the landscape of her body with the same intense focus he applied to a corporate acquisition, memorizing what made her sigh, what made her tremble, what made her cry out his name. For the first time since Julian's betrayal had hollowed out her soul, Lucinda felt whole. She felt seen not as a project or a possession, but as a woman whose strength he admired and whose spirit he cherished. She was falling in love with him, not just the powerful protector, but the man who carried the ghosts of his past with a quiet, unyielding fortitude. This newfound bliss, however, was a fragile piece built on the edge of a war zone. His world, with its unspoken codes and shadowy enemies, began to bleed into hers in ways that were impossible to ignore. His primary rivals were the Falcone family, a clan whose brutality was as legendary as their ambition. The old patriarch had recently died, leaving his volatile and reckless son Marco in charge. Marco Falcone saw Edmund's burgeoning relationship with Lucinda not as a private matter, but as a strategic weakness, a chink in the impenetrable armor of the Emerson Empire. The first strike came without warning. They were having dinner at a small, exclusive restaurant in a quiet part of the city, a place Edmund had assured her was secure. The evening was perfect, the conversation easy, the flicker of candlelight making his dark eyes seem impossibly soft. It was in that moment of perfect contentment that chaos erupted. The windows of the restaurant imploded, showering the room in a cascade of glittering glass. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed in the small space, and before Lucinda could even process what was happening, Edmund had moved. He threw himself across the table, his body a solid wall covering hers, pushing her down to the floor amidst the overturned chairs and shattered plates, the air filled with screams and the acrid smell of gunpowder. She could feel the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart against her back, a frantic drum in the symphony of violence. His men, who had been dining discreetly at other tables, materialized with weapons drawn, returning fire with a chilling, professional efficiency. The entire ordeal lasted less than a minute, but it stretched into an eternity for Lucinda, huddled beneath him on the cold, hard floor. When the silence finally returned, broken only by the whimpering of the other patrons, he slowly moved off her. There was a dark gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly onto the white tablecloth. His face was a mask of cold, murderous rage, an expression she had never seen before and one that terrified her more than the gunfire had. They were swept from the scene, bundled into an armored car that appeared out of nowhere and sped back to the fortress-like security of her apartment. The events of the evening played over and over in her mind, the shattering glass, the roar of the guns, the weight of his body protecting hers, the dark fury in his eyes. This was the price. This was the world she had chosen to enter. The safety he offered was not the absence of danger, but his presence within it. He stood by the window, his back to her once again, his wounded arm having been swiftly tended to by one of his men. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fears. She walked to her bedroom and opened her closet, her hands moving numbly as she pulled a suitcase from the top shelf. She did not know where she would go, only that she could not live like this, waiting for the next bullet, the next explosion. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. His face was unreadable, but the rage had been replaced by a deep, weary pain. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "I can't do this, Edmund," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "I can't live a life where dinner ends in a firefight. I'm not built for it." Crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, forcing her to look at him. His thumbs brushed away her tears. "Leaving me will not make you safe," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Now that they know you're mine, you will always be a target. The only place you're safe is with me." It was a stark, brutal truth. He was not trying to trap her, he was stating a fact. His world had claimed her, and it would not let her go. "I am not asking you to be built for it," he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "I am asking you to let me build a fortress around you. I promise you, Lucinda, I will end this. Marco Falcone has signed his own death warrant. I will reshape my world. I am already moving things, transitioning more of my business into legitimate channels, cutting away the rot that my father tolerated. It takes time, but I will do it, for you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her skin. I offer you my name, my future, my life. It is all I have, but I cannot right now promise you peace. I can only promise that I will stand between you and every bullet meant for you. It was the most honest, devastating proposal she could ever imagine. He was offering her a crown, but it was a crown of thorns, a promise of love intertwined with the constant threat of violence. Her choice was clear: a life of fear by his side or a life of fear alone. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. A life of fear with Edmund was still a life with him. A life without him had become an unthinkable, barren landscape. Lucinda unpacked her suitcase, the simple act a declaration of allegiance, a silent acceptance of the violent, complicated world she was now irrevocably a part of. She had chosen him with all the darkness that clung to his name, and in doing so she had chosen her side in his war. Edmund, for his part, moved with the terrifying speed and precision of a striking predator. The full weight of the Emerson Empire was brought to bear on Marco Falcone. Shipments were lost, warehouses burned, and key lieutenants disappeared from the streets. It was a systematic dismantling of his rival's power, a war fought not on battlefields but in the shadowy ledgers and back alleys of the city's underworld. Yet Marco Falcone, cornered and increasingly desperate, was like a rabid animal. He refused to fold, refused to flee. He decided to make one last, dramatic move, targeting the one thing he knew Edmund valued above his entire empire. It happened on a crisp afternoon. Lucinda was leaving the archives, walking the short, secure distance to the waiting car, flanked by two of Edmund's guards. It was a route she walked every day, a path so secure it had become mundane, but they had underestimated Falcone's desperation. Two cars screeched around the corner, boxing them in. The attack was swift and brutally efficient. Her guards were neutralized with tasers before they could even draw their weapons, and a chloroformed rag was pressed over her mouth. Her last conscious thought was of Edmund's face, the image of his promise to protect her dissolving as the world faded to black. She awoke in a cold, damp warehouse, the salty tang of the nearby river heavy in the air. Marco Falcone stood over her, a man whose slick-back hair and expensive suit could not hide the feral desperation in his eyes. He saw her not as a person, but as a pawn, a piece of leverage to be used against his enemy. Edmund did not react with the blind rage Marco had anticipated. When the call came, the demand for a transfer of all shipping territories in exchange for Lucinda's life, Edmund was preternaturally calm. He agreed to the terms, setting a time and place for the exchange, but it was all a feint, a move to keep Marco occupied while he executed his real plan. He did not go to the exchange point. Instead, he led a small, hand-picked team to the waterfront warehouse district, a place he knew better than any man in the city. He did not launch a frontal assault. He moved like a ghost through the labyrinth of decaying buildings, using his intimate knowledge of the area's forgotten tunnels and secret passages, a legacy of his family's long history in smuggling. While Marco waited for a king to surrender his crown, the king was slipping in through the back door. The confrontation was not a chaotic firefight, it was a precise strategic execution. Edmund's team took out Falcone's sentries with silenced weapons, isolating Marco and a handful of his inner circle inside the main warehouse with Lucinda. When Edmund finally kicked open the door, it was not as a warlord but as an executioner. He faced a shocked Marco Falcone who was holding a gun to Lucinda's head. "You were supposed to be at the docks, Emerson." Marco screamed, his composure finally cracking. Edmund simply looked at him, his eyes like chips of ice. "You mistake me for my father," he said, his voice low and cold. "He believed in honor among thieves, I believe only in victory." In the split second that Marco's attention wavered, distracted by the quiet efficiency with which his remaining men were being dispatched in the shadows around him, Edmund moved. He fired a single shot, not at Marco, but at a heavy chain holding a stack of cargo containers suspended from a crane. The bullet severed the link and tons of steel crashed to the ground, creating a deafening diversion. In that moment of chaos, Edmund closed the distance, disarming Marco and driving a knife into his shoulder, incapacitating him without killing him. The message was clear: this was not a battle of equals. This was a master schooling a novice. In the aftermath, amidst the wreckage and the groans of Falcone's wounded men, Edmund went to Lucinda. He cut her bonds and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled. He was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, a stray piece of shrapnel from the crashing containers. Later, back in the sanctuary of the penthouse, she cleaned the wound. Her hands were steady now, her fear replaced by a fierce, resolute calm. As she dabbed the antiseptic on his skin, she looked into his eyes. "You were right," she said softly. "The only safe place for me is with you." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "The Falcone organization no longer exists," he told her. "Their assets will be absorbed, their power broken. It's over." It was not just the end of a rival, it was the end of an era. He had consolidated his power completely, leaving no one strong enough to challenge him. The path was now clear for him to fulfill his promise, to continue the slow, difficult process of reshaping his family's legacy. He was still a king, and his throne was still built on a foundation of secrets and fear, but now he had a queen and a reason to build a better kingdom. He pulled her close, and as they stood together, looking out at the vast, glittering expanse of the city below, she knew she was home. It was a dangerous, complicated home, but it was theirs, a future they would forge together, their hard-won love, the unshakable foundation of their new empire.